everybody. This is the week 1 Romans Bible study video. If you don't have the accompanying workbook, you can get it by clicking on the link up there. And I would encourage you to make sure you have that so that you can follow along and complete the study questions week by week. Just remember, these videos will not be available after the 8-week period is over. So after April 27th, they will only be available if you have the full workbook program. So let's get into it. So each week we're going to cover 2 chapters from the book of Romans. And this week we're going to talk a little bit about some of the background of the book of Romans. So you may be familiar with the fact that Paul traveled around, obviously took a lot of missions trips. And so he's writing this book to the believers in Rome. And the believers in Rome are a mixed group. We have some Gentile believers and some Jewish believers. And I just love how that's really relevant to us today. We have just a whole mix of people who are part of the faith. And Paul really speaks to that. We come from different backgrounds. Some of us come from a really maybe legalistic background, and some of us come from, maybe a lot less legalistic background. And some of us came from a background where our story, our testimony is really powerful in how God saved us from addictions or rejection and depression. God saved us from eating disorders and all kinds of really bad stuff, and that is part of our story of redemption. And that's what this book is about. These folks have come from a background of really immoral idolatry and sexual practices, and on the Jewish side, coming from a background of really self-righteous legalism and trying to impose some of that legalism on the Gentile believers in their midst. And sometimes we're guilty of that a little bit, of imposing our own perspectives, and we'll get into that in later weeks. But these opening chapters are really about the necessity of the gospel, and Paul opens it up by talking about how excited he is about spreading the gospel, about how dear these believers are to him, and the fellowship that he looks forward to with them. And he talks a lot about sort of the contrast between the wrath of God on folks who are without any moral basis, without the law, and without knowledge of the gospel in general. So he talks about, remember, he's talking to believers, and he's saying, the wrath of God is being poured out on all mankind. And he talks about that. And then he talks about, well, it's because God has revealed himself through his creation. It says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, because that which may be known about God is plain to all. Because God has made it plain. God's not trying to hide himself. God's not trying to make it hard to see him. God's not trying to make it somehow a secret of how you can know him, how you can be close to him. It's not a secret. It's made plain to all. Because since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, they're clearly seen. It's clearly seen through all that he has made. The mark of the Creator is on everything that he has created, both out in nature and all of the natural phenomena that we see, and also in us as image bearers of God. God made us in his image, so we are image bearers, and the things about us that make us unique are also what can be seen about God. The fact that we like to create, well, God obviously being the author of humanity, the author of our lives, he created us, he's a creator. So things that are about us, those are also true about God, but we are imperfect and distorted images of God until we accept Christ. And then he works in us to make us be more and more perfectly reflecting himself. And it says, for although they knew God, they didn't glorify him or give thanks. And then Paul goes through the progression of depravity that ensues when people, they see these things, they know these things, but they reject the Lord. Because without the gospel and without acknowledging God as the author and creator of our lives, without acknowledging the Lord and humbling ourselves and saying, yes, I need you, God, because I can't come before you. I can never be good enough. I can't I can't even begin to approach your altar without you. We are left to the natural spiritual and natural physical laws that God has put in place, and that leaves us to sink into further and further into depravity. And that's what is poured out on mankind when without the gospel. This is what happens without the gospel. And from there, Paul goes right back to the Jews. So this is people who are not Jews, and why they need the gospel, because that's what happens when they don't have the gospel. They're left to the consequences of their sin. And then God, with the Jews, he says, you therefore have no excuse, because you know what God says. You've been told how to draw close to the Lord. You know about forgiveness, but you have no excuse, because at the points that you try to judge other people, you condemn yourself, because even though you have the laws of God, you can't measure up either. You can't measure up either because you don't have the gospel. You're not coming by faith either. You're trying to approach the Lord with your good works. And that's where Paul goes with the Jews. And through chapter 2, he starts going through, do you think that because, you have the laws of God and you've been trying to be faithful to that the God isn't going to call you into account as well? Do you think that you will escape God is very patient with you. God has been very kind to you. But you have your works. You don't have the gospel. So without the gospel, the Jewish folks in that time think that they might get to the Lord with their works. And then he goes through all of the ways that that the Jews fall short, and that the Jewish people behave like they're self-righteous, perhaps, and try to impose their thinking on the Gentiles. And the moral of all of that is back to the beginning, that I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the gospel that saves. It is only the gospel that saves through faith in Jesus Christ, and which is the reason why both the Gentiles and the Jews, because without the gospel, they're under God's wrath, which is why they need the gospel. And the questions in the workbook for this week help you to dig deeper into that, how you can apply that to your walk, and how you can pull that apart and look at it for today. And I encourage you to do that this week and really meditate on what God has for you and what He's speaking into your life through these 2 chapters.